You know how the news cycle just throws a million things at you every day?
Oh, absolutely. It's constant.
Well, today on the deep dive, we want to try and, cut through some of that noise.
Good plan.
We're going to look at a few situations brewing overseas, things that really make you think about how America interacts with the world.
Or sometimes chooses not to interact, right?
Exactly. We've got some head-turning developments in the Middle East, and then a pretty firm statement about a potential powder keg over in South Asia.
Yeah, these aren't just minor headlines.
No, they feel like they could be signals of some pretty significant shifts happening on the global stage. These are the kinds of things that demand a closer look,
Yeah.
Beyond the quick takes.
Absolutely. What we seem to be seeing are moments where some long-held ideas, assumptions really, guiding American foreign policy are being tested.
Tested how?
Well, either through direct actions or sometimes through very clear statements about not taking action. Non-action is policy.
Yeah.
And it forces you, or it should force you, to really drill down and think about, okay, what are a nation's core interests?
Yeah.
And what are the most effective ways, maybe the least coercive ways, to protect those interests in a world that's, well, it's always changing, always in flux.
Okay, so let's dive right into the Middle East then. For a long time, when you talked about U.S. policy there, Israel's security was kind of maybe the unwritten first rule.
That's a fair way to put it. Foundational.
But lately, there have been a few moves, few signals maybe, that seem to be, rewriting that rule book. Like, we're hearing about President Trump announcing a ceasefire with the Houthis.
Right, in Yemen?
Yeah, and these are the groups who've been, launching missiles and drones at Israel.
Directly targeting shipping and Israel. Yeah.
And apparently this ceasefire deal, it didn't come with any explicit demand for them to stop targeting Israel.
Which is notable.
Feels like a pretty big departure from how things usually work, right? What's the thinking there? Is it a shift in priorities?
It definitely breaks with established practice. For years, like you said, the principle was that Israel's security was fundamental, key to stability.
Right.
And so any threat to Israel needed a direct counter, often with U.S. backing or involvement. This move, well, it suggests a possible reevaluation. Maybe the administration is focusing on de-escalation with the Houthis for other reasons specific to U.S. interests, perhaps shipping lanes, even if that leaves Israel potentially more vulnerable.
So maybe tactical or something bigger.
That's the question, isn't it? Is this just a short-term adjustment, or does it signal a more fundamental rethinking of America's role? Maybe trying to disentangle a bit from these very long-standing conflicts.
And it's not just that one thing either. We're also hearing talk that President Trump is considering being open to Iran enriching uranium.
Right, for civilian energy purposes.
Now, anyone who's followed this knows that's a major, major shift. The worry has always been, that if Iran can enrich uranium at all,
Even for peaceful use.
it just gets them that much closer to being able to make nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
It's been a red line for so many.
A definite red line, yeah.
Yeah.
Preventing the spread of nukes, non-proliferation, it's been a cornerstone of international security for decades.
So why? Why might this even be on the table now?
Well, the concern with Iran, technically, is that the same tech, the centrifuges and know-how used to enrich uranium for power plants, is basically the same tech you need to enrich it way, way higher, to weapons grade.
Got it.
So historically, the U.S. push for really tight restrictions just block that pathway entirely.
Makes sense.
This potential change, maybe it indicates a willingness to try a different kind of engagement, perhaps relying on super strict monitoring, safeguards, inspections, hoping that can prevent weaponization.
Trust but verify turned up to 11.
Kind of. Or maybe it's part of a bigger play, a desire for some broader diplomatic deal, even if it means giving ground on something that used to be non-negotiable.
But that really makes you question the whole non-proliferation effort, doesn't it? If the U.S. seems willing to bend.
It does. It definitely raises questions about the long-term effectiveness if a major player changes its stance like that.
Right. Okay. And then there's this third piece, also in the Middle East. The idea of potentially allowing Saudi Arabia to build nuclear power plants.
For their energy grid, yeah.
But without making it conditional on them normalizing relations with Israel.
Which was the previous linkage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For a while, it really seemed like the U.S. was using Saudi Arabia's desire for nuclear tech as, like, leverage.
A carrot.
Yeah, carrot to push for that big diplomatic prize. Saudi-Israeli normalization, part of the Abraham Accords thinking, maybe.
Right.
So separating those two things, that feels very deliberate. What kind of ripples could that cause?
Oh, profound ones, potentially. That linkage, tying Saudi nuclear ambitions to normalizing with Israel, that was seen as a key strategy.
Yeah.
Reshaping the whole region.
Creating a new block, almost.
Exactly. Fostering integration, maybe stability. By decoupling them, the U.S. might be signaling, look, we're moving towards a more transactional approach.
Case by case.
Yeah. Each nation's interests addressed maybe more separately. On their own merits, perhaps.
What does that do to the balance of power?
Well, it could certainly change things. It might embolden Saudi Arabia. It could lead them to recalculate their relationships with Iran, certainly with Israel. And it definitely puts a question mark over future Arab-Israeli normalization if a key incentive, that nuclear tech approval, is taken off the table as leverage.
Okay, but now it sounds like not everyone in Washington is on board with these potential shifts.
Seems that way.
We're seeing reports that Senators Graham and Cotton, they're planning to introduce a bill.
Kind of a countermove?
Yeah, it sounds like it would try to block some of these ideas.
Yeah.
Their proposal would aim to prevent Iran from enriching uranium, period.
Back to the old red line.
And insist that any security deal with Saudi Arabia must depend on them normalizing with Israel.
So putting that linkage back in forcefully.
Right. So what is this? Is this just, the usual political back and forth, Congress versus the White House?
Could be.
Or does it signal something deeper, like a fundamental disagreement about America's strategy in the Middle East?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It could be, maybe, a good cop, bad cop strategy. The administration explores new avenues, Congress holds the traditional line, and somewhere in the middle, they hope to land a better deal.
Plausible.
Or it could just be a genuine split. Different policymakers, different factions holding really different views on what America's interests are and how best to achieve stability there. Should we use conditions? How much leverage should the U.S. apply to try and shape what other countries do?
It highlights that whole debate, intervention versus something else.
Exactly. How involved should the U.S. be in the internal or external policies of other sovereign nations? It's a perennial question.
All right. Let's shift gears. Let's head over to South Asia for a bit.
Okay. India and Pakistan.
Yeah, where tensions between these two nuclear-armed neighbors seem to be ratcheting up again.
A very dangerous situation, always potentially.
And in response to this, we heard a pretty blunt statement from Vice President Vance. He essentially said, quote, "None of our business."
Wow. That's direct.
It's a pretty stark declaration, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about potential conflict between countries that both have nuclear weapons. What's the thinking behind saying that?
It is very clear, isn't it? It's articulating a specific foreign policy view, one that really prioritizes restraint.
Restraint.
Yeah, and a much more limited definition of when and if direct American intervention is needed in these kinds of disputes. Vance's core message seems to be, look, we're obviously concerned about nuclear powers fighting.
Of course.
But the U.S. doesn't see a direct role for itself, militarily or diplomatically, in fixing the underlying problems between India and Pakistan.
And he gave some reasons, too. He talked about the obvious dangers, nuclear states in conflict, unthinkable consequences.
I've acknowledged the severity.
But then he stressed that U.S. policy would focus on de-escalation, but from a distance, not getting hands-on. Urging calm. And he even said, very plainly apparently, we can't control these countries.
That's a significant statement.
It really seems like a step away from the idea that America can or should always step in and try to shape global events. What does that signal about how this administration sees American power? Or its limits?
That's a great point. It's an acknowledgement of limits, isn't it? Even for the most powerful nation. Saying we can't control India and Pakistan, that reflects a more realist view of the world.
Realist how?
Understanding that these are independent countries, sovereign nations with their own very deep histories, their own motivations, their own security needs, and trying to impose solutions from the outside often doesn't work. Sometimes it even backfires, creates resentment.
Right.
So the focus on de-escalation through diplomacy, encouraging talks, urging restraint from the outside, it signals a preference for not deploying American resources or, crucially, taking sides.
Okay. He did acknowledge the catastrophic potential. Nuclear war is catastrophic, full stop.
Had to.
But he also seemed to assess that it wasn't, imminent right now.
His current assessment, yeah. Hopefully correct.
And ultimately, he put the responsibility squarely back on India and Pakistan themselves. Said peace depends on their diplomacy, on, quote, cooler heads prevailing there.
Placing the onus on the primary actors.
It just sounds fundamentally different from how the U.S. has often approached big international crises in the past, doesn't it? What are the bigger implications of this kind of hands-off approach?
It really boils down to a philosophy, doesn't it? A foreign policy rooted in restraint. Pragmatism, maybe. Assessing what an outside power can realistically achieve.
Okay.
The focus is on encouraging de-escalation, supporting diplomacy indirectly, but firmly rejecting the idea that the U.S. needs to get entangled in the conflict itself.
The less interventionist.
It strongly suggests that, yes. A potential broader shift away from a more interventionist posture towards, perhaps, a more selective engagement globally. Defining American interests more narrowly, focusing on what's truly vital and direct.
So, okay, let's try and wrap this up. We're looking at two really distinct situations here, but they both feel important.
Definitely interconnected in terms of what they say about U.S. policy thinking.
Right. In the Middle East, we've got these potential shifts, big changes possibly coming regarding Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, hints of a more maybe transactional, less ideological approach.
Possibly, yeah. More focused on specific deals than overarching doctrines, maybe.
And then contrasting that, over in South Asia, you have the U.S. explicitly stating, not our fight. A policy of non-intervention regarding India-Pakistan, emphasizing restraint, de-escalation from afar.
It's almost like two different playbooks being considered at the same time.
Yeah, the tale of two foreign policy approaches.
Exactly. You've got this potential reshaping of alliances and priorities in one very volatile region, and then drawing a really clear boundary around American involvement in another part of the world that carries obviously huge risks of its own.
It really makes you think, though, what are the long-term consequences? If these really are evolving foreign policy positions, what does that mean for global stability, for America's role in the world?
Big questions.
What does it actually signify when a country like the U.S. starts deciding more explicitly maybe what is and what isn't our business?
Yeah. Where are those lines drawn and why? And what happens on the other side of those lines?
It definitely prompts a lot of follow-up questions about the future in these regions and just the wider impact of these kinds of shifts in American thinking. Definitely something to keep considering long after we finish talking here.
Absolutely. Lots to watch.